Phantom Spirit of the Desert. Part 1. The desert wind cut through the late afternoon like a warning, carrying sand and silence across the empty fields of Thornfield Ranch. The sky was a flat, burning orange, and the sun cast long, trembling shadows over the dirt road that led to the old auction grounds. Mason Thornfield stood at the fence line, weathered hands gripping the wood eyes, squinting at the commotion ahead. A wild horse, tall, chestnut, muscle-packed, and furious, fought against 3 grown men. It was like watching a storm trying to be captured by ropes. Will Harrison, face red from effort, spat into the dust. "This one ain't like the others," he muttered, tightening his grip on the lead rope. The horse reared again, front legs slashing at the air nostrils, flared eyes wide, not with fear, but with defiance. Mason said nothing. He couldn't. Something about those eyes made his throat close. They weren't just wild. They were familiar. The crowd had started to gather. Ranchers, farmers, old cowhands leaning on their canes, children on their parents' shoulders. It was auction day, but the energy wasn't excitement. It was tension. The name was already spreading. The ghost horse from the desert. Even Howard Bennett, the seasoned auctioneer who'd sold everything from pigs to plows, looked uneasy. "You break him, you own him," he joked weakly. No one laughed. Eleanor Thornfield arrived late, her hands still dusty from prayer candles. She stopped beside her husband, looked at the horse, then at Mason. "It can't be," she whispered. Mason didn't respond. His jaw clenched. 32 years ago, his younger brother Daniel rode out into the desert on a horse just like that. Never came back. No body, no sign, just gone. People said coyotes. Others said he ran away. Mason never believed either. Dr. Linda Parker stepped through the crowd, her vet bag slung across her shoulder. She'd seen sick, injured feral animals before. But this... She froze as the horse. Spirit, that's what Will had called him, locked eyes with her. They were too knowing, too human. Her son Noah, just behind her, whispered, "He's not scared. He's waiting." For what? He couldn't say. Then, before anyone could move, Spirit walked into the center of the ring, stopped, and dropped to one knee. The crowd fell dead silent. Even the wind paused. Mason took one step forward. His lips parted, but no sound came. Because for a split second, just one, he could have sworn he heard Daniel's voice. The silence didn't break immediately. It clung to the air like dust after a storm. People stared unmoving as Spirit stayed on one knee, head slightly bowed, chest rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. No one dared to speak. Mason Thornfield's heart pounded loud in his ears, louder than the murmurs beginning to ripple through the crowd. Will Harrison took off his hat, rubbing the back of his neck like he'd seen a ghost. In some ways, he had. Did he just kneel? Howard Bennett muttered from the auction platform, the microphone still hot in his hand. "What kind of horse does that?" He chuckled nervously, but the sound fell flat. The crowd wasn't looking at him anymore. All eyes were on Spirit and Mason. The connection was too strange to ignore. A few of the older ranchers shifted their weight uncomfortably, like the moment reminded them of something they didn't want to feel. Eleanor moved to Mason's side, her voice low and steady. "He's not here by chance, Mason. You know that." Mason didn't reply. His hands trembled slightly as he stepped through the fence boots, hitting the dirt with a soft crunch. Whispers followed him. No one tried to stop him. He walked slow, cautious, but something inside him was pulling forward. Spirit didn't move. He just waited, eyes locked on Mason like he'd been expecting him. When Mason finally reached him, he paused a few feet away. "Dan," he whispered. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a thought. It just came out raw, cracked, real. Spirit lifted his head. For one impossible moment, Mason saw not just intelligence, but recognition in those eyes. He staggered back a step, the breath knocked from his lungs. Eleanor gasped behind him. She saw it too. Back in the crowd, Sheriff Frank Miller had arrived without a word. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked like a man who'd been waiting for this day for a long time. "Damn fool horse," he muttered under his breath, though the edge in his voice betrayed something else. Fear. He turned to Elijah Watson, who'd appeared silently beside him like smoke. The old man just nodded toward Spirit. "He came back," Elijah said. Noah Parker was the first to move. Slipping through the fence, he approached Spirit slowly. The horse turned to face him, not with aggression, but something gentler. Noah reached out, touched the side of his face. Spirit leaned into the boy's hand, and the entire crowd seemed to exhale at once. Mason looked at the horse, then at Noah, and for the first time in decades his voice cracked into a whisper. "This ain't over." That night, the Thornfield Ranch was quieter than usual. The stars above seemed to burn brighter like they were watching. Mason sat alone on the porch, rocking slowly, a bottle of untouched bourbon by his side. Spirit was in the paddock, calm, still staring out into the dark, like he was waiting for something or someone. Eleanor watched her husband from the kitchen window, her heart tight in her chest. She hadn't seen that haunted look in his eyes since Daniel vanished. Will Harrison showed up unannounced, as he always did, when something was gnawing at him. He didn't knock, just sat on the top step beside Mason, elbows on his knees. "That horse ain't right," he said after a while, but not in a bad way, in a different way, like he knows things. Mason didn't reply. He was staring at his own hands, remembering the day his brother left. The same calloused fingers, the same desert wind. The only thing missing was the goodbye. "You think it's him?" Will finally asked, voice low. "I mean Dan." The question hung in the air like smoke. Mason rubbed his face, struggling to answer. "I don't know what I believe," he admitted. "But when I looked into that horse's eyes, it felt like he was looking back, not just at me, into me." Will didn't scoff. He didn't laugh. He just nodded once solemn, because he felt it too. Meanwhile, Sheriff Frank Miller drove the long road back to town with a furrowed brow. The image of Spirit kneeling kept flashing in his mind. 32 years ago, he'd been the deputy who filed the report on Daniel Thornfield's disappearance. The case never made sense. No body, no horse, no trail. Just one broken compass found near Red Rock Canyon, and a saddlebag with initials DT. He never told Mason about the compass, or about the other thing they found. He stopped outside Elijah Watson's shack on the edge of the desert. Elijah was already outside rocking in a chair, as if he'd been expecting him. "I saw the boy today," Elijah said, eyes never leaving the horizon. Frank frowned. "Which boy?" Elijah slowly turned his head. "The one that left, but didn't die." That chilled the sheriff more than he wanted to admit. Back at the ranch, Noah couldn't sleep. He crept out to the paddock in the moonlight, barefoot hoodie zipped to his chin. Spirit was awake, ears twitching. Noah sat in the dirt beside him. "You're not just a horse, are you?" he whispered. Spirit slowly turned his head and let out a low, steady breath. Not a snort, not a sigh. A sound that felt almost human. The following morning brought a strange calm to the Thornfield Ranch. The kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The sunlight was soft, filtered through the clouds, and the usual morning sounds. Rooster's wind-creaking gates felt muffled. Mason stood by the paddock with a coffee mug in hand, staring at Spirit like he was trying to remember something long forgotten. The horse stood still, eyes fixed on him, breathing slow, steady, like he'd been waiting all night. Eleanor joined her husband in silence. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she reached into her sweater pocket and handed Mason an old photograph, wrinkled and faded. Daniel, maybe 22, smiling wide beside his chestnut horse. "That's the one," she said quietly. "The same blaze on the nose, the same eyes." Mason studied the picture, then looked back at Spirit. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. "But even if it is," he said slowly, "how would that be possible?" Will showed up again around noon, this time with an old leather satchel slung over his shoulder. "I brought something," he said, placing the bag on the porch. Inside was a journal. Daniel's journal, rescued from an old box in Will's barn, dusty, yellowed, almost forgotten. "I never told you I had it," Will admitted. "Didn't think it mattered anymore." Mason opened the cover with trembling fingers. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's. Loopy rushed young. The last entry chilled him. "If I don't come back, it means I found it, or it found me." Back in town, Sheriff Frank Miller unlocked a drawer he hadn't touched in 3 decades. Inside was a faded manila folder marked Thornfield Case 1993. Among the contents was a Polaroid of the saddlebag, found near Red Rock Canyon. Initials, clear as day, DT. But there was also a second photo one never shared with the family. It showed hoof prints in a perfect circle burned into the desert sand. No explanation. No trail in or out, just a perfect circle. Frank stared at it jaw tight. Something out there didn't want to be found. That night, Noah sat with Spirit again, reading aloud from Daniel's journal. The horse didn't move, but his ears twitched with each word like he understood. When Noah paused on one entry, "The land out past Hollow Ridge isn't dead, it's waiting." Spirit stepped closer and pressed his forehead to the boy's shoulder. Noah's hands shook. "You were his, weren't you?" he whispered. "But you're not just his anymore." Somewhere out in the desert beyond Hollow Ridge, something shifted. The wind changed direction, and for the first time in 32 years, coyotes went silent. The dirt road to Hollow Ridge hadn't been used in years. Weeds grew wild between the tire tracks, and buzzards circled above as if they knew something the humans didn't. Mason drove slow, his old truck rattling like bones. Will rode beside him silent, holding the journal like a map to buried truth. The further they went, the more the landscape changed. Not just drier, but emptier, like the land itself was holding its breath. They stopped where the trail ended right at the edge of the Red Rock cliffs. The air was still not quiet still. Even the insects were silent. Mason stepped out first, the wind catching the brim of his hat. He looked over the edge and felt his stomach drop. The canyon below looked exactly as it had 32 years ago, unchanged, untouched. "This is where Dan disappeared," he said flatly. "Last place he was seen." Will pulled out the journal and turned to a page marked with a folded corner. Dan had written about a clearing beyond the ridge where the horses go to die or come back. They scanned the area. No clearing, no trail until Spirit appeared from the tree line. Mason hadn't even heard him coming. The horse stopped in front of them, lifted his head, and turned toward the far slope. Then he started walking slow, deliberate, like retracing old steps. Back at the ranch, Eleanor was sitting on the porch when Sheriff Frank Miller pulled in. His face was pale, holding something wrapped in cloth. "I kept this from Mason," he admitted, "and I was wrong." He unwrapped a small, weather-worn compass initials carved on the back DT. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "He carried this everywhere," she whispered. Frank looked down. "We found it out past Hollow Ridge, but we didn't tell. We thought it would break him." Noah, meanwhile, had stayed behind with Spirit until the horse took off unexpectedly. The boy jumped the fence and ran after him. Somehow, even barefoot, he managed to keep up. Spirit led him toward the same trail Mason had taken. The same wind that once whispered Daniel's name now seemed to call Noah too, as if the desert recognized the bloodline. At the edge of the ridge, Spirit stopped again, not out of fear, but memory. He scraped his hoof against a patch of dry ground, exposing a shape beneath the dust. Mason knelt down and uncovered it with his bare hands, a rusted horseshoe still warm to the touch. This was his, Mason whispered, voice trembling. The wind picked up, carrying a sound with it, a name. Dan. The clearing beyond Hollow Ridge wasn't marked on any map. You couldn't see it from above or reach it by accident. It revealed itself only when you were meant to find it. And today that time had come. Spirit led the way, moving without hesitation. Mason and Will followed in silence, ducking under dry branches, boots crunching old leaves and brittle twigs. The air grew cooler, heavier. Time seemed to slow, like the desert was holding its breath. The path opened suddenly into a sunlit space, surrounded by red stone walls. In the center stood a lone tree, gnarled, ancient, out of place. Spirit stopped and stood beside it, lowering his head. Mason stepped closer, heart thudding in his chest. The ground beneath the tree was disturbed, the soil darker than the rest. Not fresh, but marked. He was here, Mason murmured. This is where it ended or where it began. Will knelt and brushed the dirt aside, revealing a piece of cracked leather, a saddle strap with initials burned into it, DDT. He looked up at Mason, his eyes wide. He made it this far, he said. Maybe he stayed. That idea hit Mason like a freight train. All these years he thought Dan had died lost and alone. But what if he'd chosen to stay? Or worse, what if something had made him stay back at the ranch? Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with Sheriff Miller. The compass lay between them, spinning slowly, as if pulled by something unseen. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked. Frank nodded. "We found tracks, not just horses' boots." "Someone walked back out of the canyon months after Dan vanished. We assumed it was hikers, but now I'm not so sure." Eleanor stared at the compass, which had stopped spinning and now pointed directly west. Meanwhile, Noah had followed the trail all the way to the tree line. Breathless, shaking, he stepped into the clearing, just as Spirit turned to look at him. The boy froze. He felt a wave of something. Not fear, not awe. Something deeper. Recognition. The way you feel when you walk into a room you've never been in but somehow know. Dan was here, wasn't he? He whispered. Spirit let out a low exhale and took one step toward the boy. Mason turned to Spirit. "You came back to bring us here," he said, voice cracking. "You remembered what we forgot." And just then, as if on cue, a noise came from the far side of the clearing. The sound of hooves, but not Spirit's. Another horse, another presence, and Mason felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in decades. Hope and dread side by side. The horse that emerged from the far side of the clearing was unlike Spirit. He was older bones visible beneath his sun-bleached coat with a limp in his step and eyes clouded by time. Yet there was a calmness to him, like he belonged here. Will's hand went to his side instinctively, but Spirit didn't react. He stepped forward toward the old horse and let out a quiet, breathy whinny. A greeting, not a challenge. Mason stepped forward slowly. "I know that horse," he muttered. "I swear to God I've seen him before." Will narrowed his eyes. "He's the one Dan was riding back in '93. That's the same damn horse." But how could that be? 32 years had passed. No horse should still be alive. Not out here. Not in this condition. And yet, here he was, breathing, watching, waiting. Noah approached, carefully brushing his hand along the old horse's neck. "He's not just a horse either," the boy whispered. "There's something still in him, like a memory that doesn't die." Spirit stood beside the older horse now, both of them looking toward the base of the tree. There, tucked into the roots, was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Mason knelt, heart pounding, and slowly unwrapped it, revealing a journal. A second journal. The cover was worn, almost brittle, but the name inside was clear. Daniel Thornfield. Mason stared at the pages, flipping through quickly. They were full. Dozens of entries, stories, thoughts. But one entry stopped him cold. "I stayed because the land wouldn't let me leave. I became part of it, and now it remembers me through the eyes of the horse." His hand trembled. "He didn't die," Mason whispered. "He became something else." Will's mouth was dry. "You think he changed?" Mason shook his head. "No, I think the desert changed him." At that moment, a wind rose, sudden, dry, and strange. It swept through the clearing, rustling the tree, the journals the dust. The old horse let out a low, almost sorrowful sound, then slowly backed into the brush from where he came, disappearing again. Spirit stood still, ears perked, but didn't follow. Instead, he looked to Mason, not just looking at him, but into him. Behind them, Noah held the second journal close to his chest, eyes wide with wonder and fear. "Mr. Thornfield," he said softly, "I don't think he's gone. I think he's part of Spirit now." Mason didn't answer. He couldn't because deep down, something in him already knew it was true. That night, back at the Thornfield Ranch, no one slept. The sky hung low and heavy, as if it too was bearing the weight of what they had uncovered. Mason sat at the kitchen table, both journals open before him. His hands were stained with old dust and ink. Eleanor poured him coffee without a word, her eyes scanning the pages. "He wasn't trapped," she said quietly. "He stayed by choice. Something called him." Mason nodded slowly. And now Spirit's carrying him. Not just memories. Something deeper. He closed the older journal and ran a finger over the cover. The way he looked at me. It wasn't just instinct. It was Dan, his soul, maybe. Or part of it. Eleanor took his hand in hers, squeezing gently. Then he came home. Meanwhile, Noah sat in the barn, resting his head against Spirit's shoulder. The horse didn't move, didn't flinch. His breathing was calm, like he was finally at peace. Noah whispered, "I can feel him in you," like he's still talking, but without words. The boy opened the newer journal again, reading entries written just weeks before Daniel vanished. The last line read, "If I disappear, it's not the end. It's just the beginning of another kind of story." At dawn, Sheriff Frank Miller pulled up in his cruiser, holding something wrapped in leather. He stepped into the barn and handed it to Mason. Inside was the original report, the one he'd kept hidden all those years. "I lied," Frank said flatly. "We found more than a compass. We found boot prints next to a circle burned into the ground. No explanation. No trail in or out, just gone." He swallowed hard. But now, I think he never left. Not really. Elijah Watson appeared at the barn door, leaning heavily on his cane. "Desert, don't forget," he rasped. "You leave a part of yourself out there. It'll find a way to send it back." He stepped toward Spirit, staring into the horse's eyes. "Welcome back, Dan," he whispered. No one corrected him. Mason placed a hand gently on Spirit's mane. "You waited long enough," he said, voice thick with emotion. "We're not letting you go this time." Outside, the wind picked up rushing through the grass like a sigh. The sky broke open with morning light, golden and soft. Spirit stood tall, calm and still, not just a horse anymore, but a vessel for something that refused to be forgotten. Phantom Spirit of the Desert, Part 2. The days following their discovery in the clearing changed everything at Thornfield Ranch. The air itself felt different, lighter, in some ways heavier in others. Mason spent most mornings in the paddock with Spirit, just standing in silence, watching, waiting. For what he couldn't say. Word spread through town like wildfire. A wild horse kneeling before a man. A horse that seemed to remember a rider long gone. People drove by the ranch, slowly hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghost horse, as they'd started calling him. Some left offerings at the front gate. Bundles of sage dream catchers, even photographs of their own lost loved ones. Sheriff Frank Miller did his best to keep the curious at bay. "Man's got a right to his privacy," he'd say, turning folks away. But Mason could see the unease in Frank's eyes each time he visited. The lawman was still wrestling with the truth he'd hidden for decades. Eleanor found herself drawn to the kitchen garden she'd neglected for years. The soil there had been hard-packed and dead since Daniel vanished, no matter what she planted. Now, inexplicably, Shoots of desert wildflowers were pushing up through the earth plants she'd never sown. "It's like the land is waking up," she told Mason over coffee one morning, her eyes following Spirit as he grazed peacefully in the paddock. "Like it's remembered something." Mason nodded slowly. Or someone. Will Harrison arrived just after sunrise with his old pickup loaded with fence posts and tools. He'd taken it upon himself to repair the boundaries of the Thornfield property, fortifying it against the curious and the skeptical alike. "Figure we ought to keep the gawkers out," he said, hammering a post into the hard ground. "Folks in town are saying all kinds of things." Mason helped him unload. "What kind of things?" Will wiped sweat from his brow. "Some say Daniel's ghost is haunting the horse. Others think it's some kind of possession." He hesitated. "The pastor's wife is organizing a prayer group. Says she's concerned for your souls." Mason snorted. "Bit late for that." Will didn't laugh. "Not everyone sees it that way, Mace. Howard Bennett's been telling anyone who'll listen that the horse should be destroyed. Says it ain't natural." Mason's face darkened. "Let him try." Will placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "I'm just saying, there are people who don't understand what's happening here. Hell, I'm not sure I do either." "I don't need them to understand," Mason said firmly. "I just need them to stay away." As they worked, Noah Parker appeared at the edge of the property, backpack slung over one shoulder. The boy had taken to visiting daily since the discovery at Hollow Ridge. His mother, Dr. Linda Parker, had given her reluctant permission after seeing how Spirit responded to her son. "Morning, Mr. Thornfield, Mr. Harrison," Noah called, climbing over the half-finished fence. Will tipped his hat. "Shouldn't you be in school, boy?" "It's Saturday, sir," Noah replied with a grin. "Well, I'll be." Will chuckled. "Lose track of days out here." Mason nodded toward the barn. "Spirit's inside." "Been restless all morning." Noah's expression grew serious. "I brought something." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a smooth, flat stone with copper-colored veins running through it. "Found it by the creek behind our house. It's the same kind of stone that was in the clearing under the tree." Mason took it, turning it over in his weathered hands. It was warm to the touch, though the morning air was cool. "How did you know?" "I didn't," Noah admitted. "It just called to me, I guess. Like it wanted to be found." The three of them walked to the barn, where Spirit stood waiting, as if he'd been expecting them. When he saw the stone in Mason's hand, the horse's ears pricked forward, and he let out a soft, nickering sound. "He knows it," Noah whispered. Mason approached slowly, holding out the stone. Spirit dipped his head, pressing his velvety muzzle against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a tremor ran through the horse's powerful body, and his eyes, those two knowing eyes, closed briefly. When they opened again, Mason gasped. The rich brown of Spirit's irises seemed to glow from within copper flecks, catching the barn's dim light. Will took a step back, crossing himself instinctively. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered. Noah moved closer, unafraid. He placed a hand on Spirit's neck. "It's still him," the boy assured them. "He's just more awake now." Later that afternoon, Eleanor found Mason sitting on the porch, both journals open in his lap. He'd been comparing entries, searching for patterns, clues, anything that might explain what was happening. "You should eat something," she said, gently offering him a sandwich. Mason took it absently, his eyes never leaving the pages. "Dan wrote about the stones," he said. "Here and here." He pointed to passages in both journals. He called them memory stones, said they hold the echoes of what's happened near them. Eleanor sat beside him. "What does that mean for Spirit?" Mason shook his head. "I'm not sure yet, but I think these stones are how Dan is able to connect with the horse somehow." He looked up at his wife, his eyes tired but alive with a spark she hadn't seen in years. "Eleanor, I think Dan found something out there. Something old. Something Powerful. She took his hand, and now it's found us. In town, tensions were rising. Sheriff Frank Miller sat in his office radio, crackling with reports of trespassers near the Thornfield property line. He'd already caught 2 teenagers trying to sneak onto the ranch with cameras. For our YouTube channel, they'd explained, as if that made it better. Frank rubbed his temples. The migraine he'd been fighting all day was getting worse. So were the dreams. Every night since Spirit had appeared, he'd been dreaming of that perfect circle of burned earth they'd found 32 years ago. In the dreams, he was standing in the center of it, and something was watching him from just beyond the edge. A knock at his door startled him. Howard Bennett stood there, hat in hands, a delegation of concerned citizens behind him. "We need to talk, Sheriff," Howard said firmly. Frank sighed. "Come in, then." He gestured for Howard to take a seat, while the others crowded into the small office. "What's on your mind?" "That horse," Howard began, without preamble. "It ain't right what Mason Thornfield's doing, feeding into this superstition." Murmurs of agreement rose from the group. "We've got people driving in from 3 counties over to see this so-called ghost horse. It's disruptive. It's dangerous." Frank leaned back in his chair. "Far as I can tell, Mason's minding his own business on his own property. He's not charging admission or putting on a show." "That's not the point," Howard countered. "This whole thing is unnatural, and you know it." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You were there, Frank. 32 years ago when Daniel Thornfield disappeared. You know there was something strange about that case." Frank's face hardened. "I know there was a young man who went missing. That's all." "That's not what Elijah Watson says," one of the men in the back spoke up. "Elijah Watson is a superstitious old fool," Frank snapped, though he didn't believe his own words. Howard's eyes narrowed. "Maybe. Or maybe he knows more than you're willing to admit. He's been telling stories about that ridge for years, about places where the world thins out, where things come through that shouldn't." "This is ridiculous," Frank stood up. "I won't have this kind of talk in my office." "Then we'll take it elsewhere," Howard said, rising to meet him. "But this isn't over, Frank. That horse isn't normal. And whatever's happening at the Thornfield place needs to stop before someone gets hurt." After they left, Frank sat alone in the quiet of his office, the old case file open on his desk. The photograph of the burned circle stared up at him accusingly. He'd lied to them, just as he'd lied to Mason all those years ago. Because the truth was, he'd seen something that day out by Hollow Ridge. Something he'd spent 32 years trying to forget. Back at the ranch, Noah had taken to reading aloud from Daniel's journals to Spirit each afternoon. The horse would stand perfectly still, ears forward, like he was drinking in every word. Mason often joined them, sitting quietly on an upturned bucket, adding context to the entries when Noah had questions. "It says here he found the first memory stone after a lightning storm," Noah said, looking up from the page. "That the lightning seemed to strike in a pattern around Hollow Ridge." Mason nodded. "There was a big storm that spring. Lightning hit all along the ridgeline. When it was over, Dan rode out to check the cattle and came back with that first stone." He pointed to a smooth, dark rock, now sitting on the windowsill of the barn. "Said it was warm, even though the storm had passed hours before." Noah ran his fingers over the entry. He writes that when he held it, he could hear voices. Not like ghosts or anything, but like memories pressed into the stone. The boy looked up at Spirit. "Do you think that's how he's still here? Through the stones?" Mason considered the question carefully. I think maybe Dan found a way to bind himself to this place, to the land, and now he's found a way back through Spirit." "But why now?" Noah asked. "Why, after all this time?" Mason had no answer for that. As dusk fell, Will returned with news from town. "Howard Bennett stirring up trouble," he reported grimly. "Got about 20 people convinced the horse is possessed by something evil. They're talking about coming out here." "Don't." Mason's jaw tightened. "Let them come." Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, worry etched on her face. Violence won't solve this, Mason. I'm not looking for violence, he replied, but I won't let them near Spirit either. Will shifted uncomfortably. There's something else. Elijah Watson's gone missing. Mason turned sharply. What do you mean, missing? No one's seen him since yesterday. His shack's empty. Fire was cold. Frank's got deputies out looking, but... Will trailed off with a shrug. A chill ran down Mason's spine. Elijah had been the one person in town who seemed to understand what was happening from the start. His disappearance now couldn't be coincidence. We need to go back to Hollow Ridge, Mason decided suddenly. Tomorrow, at dawn. Will's eyebrows shot up. Why? Because whatever's happening, it started there. And I think Elijah knew it. Mason looked out toward the paddock where Spirit stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. And I think he's gone to find answers. That night, the dream came to Mason for the first time. He was standing in a perfect circle of burned earth. The desert stretched endlessly around him, but it wasn't empty. Shapes moved at the edges of his vision horses, hundreds of them running in circles around him, never crossing the burned line. In the center of the circle stood Daniel, but not as Mason remembered him. This Daniel was older, weathered, his skin as dark as the desert stones. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It's waking up, Mason. The old one beneath the ridge. It's hungry. Mason tried to step toward his brother, but his feet wouldn't move. Dan, what happened to you? Daniel's eyes, so like Spirit's, now fixed on him. I made a choice. I became part of it to keep it sleeping. But someone's disturbed the stones. The circle is breaking. Who disturbed them? But Daniel was fading, becoming transparent in the pre-dawn light. Find Elijah. He knows where the anchor stone is. Without it, the circle can't be remade. Mason woke with a gasp, sweat-soaked and trembling. Eleanor was already awake beside him, her face pale in the moonlight. You were talking in your sleep, she whispered, calling for Dan. Mason sat up, his heart still racing. I saw him, Eleanor. Not like a memory or a dream. He was there. He was real. Eleanor didn't question him. After all they'd seen in the past week, a prophetic dream seemed almost mundane. What did he tell you? Mason swung his legs over the side of the bed. That we're in danger. That something's waking up under Hollow Ridge. Something old. He pulled on his clothes with urgent movements. I need to find Elijah Watson. But Elijah had found them first. When Mason stepped onto the porch, the old man was there, sitting in the rocking chair, still as death in the pre-dawn light. For a moment, Mason thought he might indeed be dead. But then Elijah's cloudy eyes opened. You've seen it now, he said without preamble. The truth. Mason approached cautiously. Where have you been, Elijah? Walking the circle, the old man replied cryptically. Checking the stones. 3 are missing now. His gnarled hands clutched something wrapped in faded red cloth. The anchor stone is still safe. I kept it all these years waiting. Waiting for what? Elijah's eyes, despite their cataracts, seemed to pierce straight through Mason. For the horse to return. For Daniel to call to us. Mason sat down heavily on the porch step. What is it? What's beneath the ridge? The old ones called it different names, Elijah said softly. The Devourer. The Hollow One. It sleeps in cycles, waking every few generations to feed. He looked out toward the paddock where Spirit stood, watching them intently. Your brother found it waking. He made a bargain. What kind of bargain? Elijah unwrapped the cloth, revealing a stone unlike any Mason had seen before. It was perfectly round midnight black, with a single vein of copper running through its center like a closed eye. He bound himself to the land, became its guardian, holding the hunger at bay. And the horse spirit, a vessel, Elijah explained. Animals can cross more easily between worlds, especially horses. They've always been messengers, bridges between realms. He rewrapped the stone carefully. But someone's been taking the boundary stones, breaking the circle that keeps the old ones sleeping. Howard Bennett, Mason realized aloud. He wants to stop whatever's happening here. Elijah nodded gravely, without understanding what he's unleashing. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Spirit had approached the fence line, watching them with those impossibly knowing eyes. Mason could feel the connection between them strengthening with each passing day. Not just memories of Daniel, but something of his essence, his soul. "What do we do?" Mason asked. "We remake the circle," Elijah said simply, "before the next new moon, 3 days from now. And if we don't," the old man's expression grew somber, "then what your brother held back for 32 years will wake fully, and it will consume everything first, the land, then the town, then beyond." Inside the house, the phone rang. Eleanor answered it, then called urgently for Mason. "It's Frank. There's a crowd gathering in town. Howard's got them riled up. They're coming here." Mason stood, determination hardening his features. "Call Will. Tell him to bring Noah. We're going to Hollow Ridge today. Now." Elijah rose shakily to his feet. The anchor stone must be placed first at the highest point of the ridge, the others arranged in sequence around it. "We don't have all the stones," Mason pointed out. "You said 3 were missing." A faint smile crossed the old man's weathered face. "The horse knows where they are. He's been trying to tell you." Mason looked toward Spirit, who was now pawing at the ground insistently, head bobbing as if trying to communicate something urgent. "Then we'd better start listening." Within the hour, Will had arrived with his truck, Noah riding shotgun. The boy's backpack bulged with the stones he'd collected, not just the one from the creek, but 4 others he'd been drawn to over the past days. "I didn't know why I was gathering them," he admitted as they loaded up. "It just felt important." Mason nodded, unsurprised. The boy's connection to Spirit to Daniel had been clear from the start. "We'll need them all." Eleanor emerged from the house with a rifle in her hands. "I'm coming too," she said firmly. Mason started to protest, but the look in her eyes silenced him. For 32 years, she'd waited for answers about Daniel's disappearance. She deserved to be part of this. "What about the ranch?" he asked instead. "Howard and his people." "Sheriff Miller's setting up a roadblock at the turnoff," Will informed them, "buying us some time. But we need to move fast." They loaded into Will's truck, Spirit following behind them like a faithful dog rather than a half-wild horse. Elijah sat in the bed of the truck, the anchor stone cradled in his lap, eyes fixed on the horizon where Hollow Ridge cut a jagged line against the morning sky. As they drove, Mason filled them in on what he'd learned from his dream, and from Elijah. Eleanor listened in silence, her hand steady on the rifle across her knees. Noah kept glancing back at Spirit, who matched their pace effortlessly despite the increasing heat. "How did Daniel know what to do?" the boy asked finally. "About the stones and the circle." Elijah, who could somehow hear them, despite the wind and engine noise, spoke up. "The land told him, as it told my father and his father before him. Some can hear it clearer than others." His clouded eyes found Noah's. "Like you, boy." Noah swallowed hard. "I don't hear anything. Not like that." "Not with your ears," Elijah corrected. "With something deeper." Will kept his eyes on the rough track leading to Hollow Ridge. "All due respect, Mr. Watson, but this sounds like a bunch of superstitious nonsense." "Then why are you here, William Harrison?" Elijah asked pointedly. Will gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Because Mason's my friend. And because—" He trailed off. "Because you felt it too," Elijah finished for him. "The hunger waking." Will didn't deny it. The nightmares had been plaguing him as well. Dreams of a vast darkness spreading outward from Hollow Ridge, consuming everything in its path. Dreams of Daniel calling for help from within that darkness. They reached the ridge as the sun climbed higher, the heat already shimmering off the rocky ground. Spirit had moved ahead of them, now leading the way with purpose. He stopped at the base of a steep trail that wound up toward the highest point of the ridge. "We'll have to go on foot from here," Mason said, helping Elijah down from the truck bed. The old man clutched the wrapped stone to his chest, breathing heavily in the thin, hot air. "The anchor stone must be placed by noon," he insisted, "when the sun is highest." They began the ascent, Spirit moving ahead of them, stopping occasionally to ensure they were following. Noah stayed close to the horse, one hand resting lightly on his flank. Eleanor and Will brought up the rear, both scanning the horizon for any sign of Howard's mob. The climb was grueling, the sun beating down mercilessly as they picked their way up the rocky slope. Twice Elijah nearly collapsed, but refused to relinquish the anchor stone to anyone else. "It must be carried by a guardian," he explained between labored breaths, "one who knows the old ways." Mason supported the old man as best he could, worry gnawing at him. Elijah was pushing himself too hard. His weathered face had taken on an ashen hue, and his steps were becoming increasingly unsteady. About halfway up, Spirit suddenly veered off the path, heading toward a narrow crevice in the rock face. Noah followed without hesitation. The others watched as the boy disappeared into the shadow of the crevice, then emerged moments later, excitement on his face. "There's a stone in there," he called back to them. "A memory stone. It's glowing." Mason and Elijah exchanged looks. "The first of the missing 3, Elijah confirmed. The horse remembered. With the recovered stone safely tucked into Noah's backpack, they continued their ascent. Spirit led them to 2 more locations off the main path, each hiding another memory stone, one buried beneath a pile of smaller rocks, the other wedged into the hollow of a dead juniper tree. "Someone tried to hide them," Will observed. "Scatter them." "Howard," Mason guessed grimly. "He must have found this place after Daniel disappeared." By the time they reached the summit, Elijah was barely able to stand. They helped him to a flat area at the very peak of the ridge. From here they could see for miles in every direction, the town in the distance, the Thornfield Ranch, and the vast empty desert stretching toward the horizon. "There," Elijah pointed with a trembling finger, "the center of the circle." In the middle of the flat area was a shallow depression in the rock, perfectly circular, as if carved by deliberate hands. Elijah unwrapped the anchor stone and placed it carefully in the depression. It fit perfectly the copper vein catching the midday sun like a slash of fire. "Now the others," Elijah directed, "in a circle starting from the east, 3 paces apart." Noah unloaded the stones from his backpack. There were 12 in total, 9 that he'd collected, plus the 3 they'd recovered on the ascent. Under Elijah's guidance, they began placing them in a wide circle around the anchor stone. As each stone touched the ground, a subtle change came over the air. It grew heavier, charged like the moments before a thunderstorm. By the time they placed the final stone completing the circle, the sky overhead had darkened despite the lack of clouds. Spirit stood at the edge of the circle, trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the anchor stone at the center. Suddenly, the horse let out a high, piercing whinny that seemed to echo far beyond what was natural. The sound reverberated off the rocks across the desert, carrying for miles. In that moment, Mason felt a presence wash over him, familiar yet changed. Daniel. Not just a memory or a ghost, but somehow present more fully than he'd been even through Spirit. "He's here," Noah whispered, eyes wide. "I can feel him." Eleanor stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Daniel!" The air within the circle shimmered like heat waves rising from sun-baked earth. For a heartbeat, Mason thought he could see a figure standing there, tall, lean, with their father's broad shoulders and their mother's gentle eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by a deepening shadow that seemed to gather beneath the anchor stone. Elijah's voice rang out surprisingly strong. "It is done. The circle is remade. The bargain renewed. The shadow pulsed once, twice, then seemed to sink into the earth itself. The heaviness in the air dissipated, replaced by a sense of profound relief like the breaking of a fever. Elijah collapsed, then his ancient body finally giving out. Mason caught him before he hit the ground, easing him down gently. The old man's breathing was shallow, his eyes unfocused. "Is it over?" Mason asked urgently. "Is it contained?" Elijah's lips barely moved. "For another generation. Your brother's sacrifice holds." Sacrifice. But he's still here in some way. Through spirit, through the stones. A faint smile touched Elijah's weathered face. "Not all sacrifices require death, Mason Thornfield. Some require eternal vigilance instead." His clouded eyes sought spirit. He chose to become the guardian, to bind himself to this place, to hold back what sleeps beneath. Will knelt beside them. "But what is it? What's down there?" Elijah's voice grew fainter. "The hunger that has no name. The emptiness that consumes. It was here before the first people. It'll be here after the last." His gnarled hand grasped Mason's arm with surprising strength. "You must become the keeper of the circle now. The knowledge must pass on." Mason shook his head. "I don't know how." "The horse will show you." "Daniel will show you." Elijah's eyes drifted closed. "The land remembers those who serve it." With those words, the old man's breathing slowed, then stopped altogether. He passed peacefully, his wrinkled face relaxing into an expression of profound relief. After decades as the keeper of secrets, Elijah Watson had finally passed his burden to another. They stood in silence around his body, the circle of stones a silent witness. Spirit approached, nudging Elijah's hand gently with his muzzle. A goodbye, perhaps, or a welcome to whatever lay beyond. "We should bring him back," Eleanor said softly after a time. "Give him a proper burial." Mason nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the anchor stone at the center of the circle. The copper vein now pulsed faintly like a heartbeat, like it was alive. "What now?" Noah asked, voicing what they were all thinking. Mason looked at Spirit, who returned his gaze steadily. In those eyes, he saw his brother's determination, his courage. And something else, a peace that came from purpose. "Now we keep the circle," Mason said simply. "We become the guardians." Will looked skeptical. "Just like that? We're supposed to come up here regularly and check on some rocks." "It's more than that," Noah said with certainty. "It's about remembering, keeping the story alive." He gestured to the circle. "This isn't just stones. It's a connection to the land, to what came before." As if in confirmation, Spirit walked deliberately to the center of the circle and stood over the anchor stone. The horse lowered his head until his muzzle nearly touched the stone. A tremor ran through his powerful body, and when he raised his head again, his eyes glowed with the same copper light they'd seen in the barn. The message was clear. Spirit, carrying something of Daniel within him, would be the primary guardian. But he needed them too. Needed their understanding, their belief, their willingness to remember. They carefully wrapped Elijah's body in a blanket from Will's truck and carried him down the ridge. The descent was easier than the climb, as if the land itself was helping them, smoothing their path. When they reached the truck, Sheriff Frank Miller was waiting for them, his cruiser parked beside Will's vehicle. "Howard and his people tried to reach your ranch," he informed them. "I turned them back, told them you were all gone, that the horse was gone too." He noticed the bundle they carried. "Elijah," Mason nodded grimly. "His heart gave out. Up on the ridge." Frank removed his hat respectfully. He was a good man, knew things the rest of us were too stubborn or scared to see. He looked up at the ridge towering above them. "Did you do what needed doing?" "You knew?" Eleanor asked, surprised. Frank's weathered face was solemn. "I suspected. Elijah tried to tell me years ago after Daniel disappeared. I didn't want to listen then. He looked at Spirit, who stood apart from them, regal and watchful. "But I've been dreaming. Same as you, I'd wager." Mason studied the sheriff carefully. "The circle is remade. The thing beneath the ridge will sleep again. For a time." Frank nodded relief, evident in his posture. "And Daniel, is he?" Mason glanced at Spirit. "He made a choice, a sacrifice, to protect us all." Noah stepped forward, the backpack of collected stones still slung over his shoulder. "He's still here, in the land, in spirit, in the memories." The boy's young face was serious beyond his years. "As long as we remember, he's not gone." Frank seemed to accept this, though Mason could see the questions still lingering in his eyes. Questions that perhaps would never have complete answers. "What about Howard and the others?" Will asked practically. "I'll handle them," Frank promised. "Some stories aren't meant for everyone. Some truths need protecting." He looked meaningfully at Mason. "Tuh, just like some circles." They loaded Elijah's body into Frank's cruiser. The sheriff would see to proper arrangements in town. As for the rest of them, they had a new purpose, now guardians of a secret as old as the land itself. As they drove back toward the ranch, Spirit loping easily alongside Mason, felt a weight settle onto his shoulders. Not a burden, exactly, but a responsibility. For 32 years, he'd searched for answers about his brother's disappearance. Now he had them, though not in any form he could have imagined. Daniel hadn't been taken from them. He'd given himself to something larger, an ancient bargain, a sacred duty. And now, through Spirit, he'd called his family to join him in that duty. The sun was beginning its descent as they approached Thornfield Ranch. The buildings looked different somehow, more vibrant, more a part of the landscape rather than imposed upon it. Eleanor's garden was visibly greener, with new shoots pushing up through soil that had been barren for decades. "The land remembers those who serve it," Mason murmured, recalling Elijah's words. Noah, who had been quiet for most of the drive back, suddenly spoke up. "We should mark the stones, create a map, so others will know if they're ever moved again." Mason nodded approvingly. "Good thinking." "And we should record everything," the boy continued enthusiastically. "Daniel's journals Elijah's knowledge, what we experienced today. Create our own record." Will, who'd been skeptical throughout much of their adventure, found himself nodding in agreement. "A record for the next generation of guardians," he said thoughtfully. "Makes sense." Eleanor reached for Mason's hand. "Daniel would be proud of what we did today." Mason squeezed her fingers gently. "He knows. He's still with us." As if in confirmation, Spirit broke away from the truck and galloped ahead, powerful and free. The setting sun caught his chestnut coat, turning it to living flame. For a moment, just a moment, Mason could have sworn he saw a rider on the horse's back, a familiar silhouette sitting tall and proud. Then it was gone, and Spirit was just Spirit again. But changed, as they all were. Changed by the truth of what lay beneath Hollow Ridge. Changed by the circle of stones that kept it sleeping. Changed by the knowledge that Daniel Thornfield hadn't been lost to them all those years ago. He had become something more, a guardian, a protector, a memory carried in the blood of the land itself. And now, through Spirit, he had come home. Phantom Spirit of the Desert, Part 3. The days after remaking the circle brought a deceptive calm to Thornfield Ranch. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, as if a great pressure had been relieved. Eleanor's garden flourished with unexpected vigor, wildflowers sprouting in patterns that resembled the stone circle on the ridge. Spirit had settled into a rhythm, spending mornings in the paddock and afternoons roaming freely across the property, always returning by sunset. But in town, tensions continued to simmer. Howard Bennett had not given up his crusade, merely shifted tactics. Instead of gathering a mob, he moved through the community with quiet purpose, sowing doubts and fears. "Unnatural," he would whisper to neighbors at the general store. Blasphemous, he murmured after church services. Sheriff Frank Miller did his best to counteract these rumors. He'd arranged a simple, dignified funeral for Elijah Watson, well attended, despite the old man's reputation for eccentricity. During the service, Frank had spoken plainly about Elijah's deep connection to the land, his wisdom, and his role as keeper of local history, carefully framing the truth in terms the townspeople could accept without fear. Mason had stood at the back of the small church, hat in hand, watching the community pay its respects. Eleanor beside him, Noah and his mother a few rows ahead. Will Harrison had served as a pallbearer, his weather-beaten face solemn with newfound understanding. Howard Bennett had not attended. 3 days after the funeral, Mason sat at his kitchen table, carefully binding Daniel's 2 journals together with a leather cord. They would become the first entries in what Noah had dubbed the Guardian's Record, a comprehensive documentation of the circle, the stones, and the entity that slept beneath Hollow Ridge. Eleanor set a cup of coffee beside him. "I found this in Daniel's old room," she said, placing a small wooden box on the table. "I think it's meant to go with the journals." Mason opened it carefully. Inside lay a collection of small sketches, detailed drawings of each memory stone, with notations about where they'd been found originally and what memories they seemed to hold. There was also a rough map of Hollow Ridge, with the circle marked clearly at its peak, and notations about astronomical alignments during solstices and equinoxes. He was preparing, Mason realized, even before he disappeared. He was learning recording. Eleanor nodded. He always had that artist's eye for detail. Remember how he used to sketch the horses? Mason smiled faintly at the memory. Better than any photograph. The sound of hoofbeats approaching the house pulled them from their reminiscence. Spirit had returned from his daily wandering, but he wasn't alone. Noah Parker rode bareback on the great chestnut stallion, his young face alight with excitement. Mason hurried onto the porch, astonishment and concern battling within him. Spirit had allowed no one to ride him since his arrival, not even Mason himself, after that one symbolic journey. "Noah, what are you doing?" The boy slid easily from Spirit's back, patting the horse's neck affectionately. "He asked me to," he said simply, as if this explained everything. "We went to the ridge. He wanted to show me something." Eleanor joined them, her eyes wide with wonder. "He let you ride him?" Noah nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a smooth, flat stone, smaller than the memory stones, but with the same distinctive copper veining. "We found this near the circle. It was half buried like it was trying to hide." Mason took the stone cautiously. Unlike the memory stones, which radiated a gentle warmth, this one felt cool to the touch. "Did you sense anything from it?" Noah's expression grew serious. "Not memories. More like a warning." He glanced at Spirit, who stood watchful and alert. "Spirit was agitated when we found it. He wanted me to bring it here to you." Mason turned the stone over in his hand. There were faint markings etched into its surface, not natural formations, but deliberate carvings. Symbols he didn't recognize. "We should document this," he said, already thinking of the Guardian's record they were assembling. "And I think we need to talk to Dr. Winters at the university. She's an anthropologist who specializes in indigenous artifacts. If anyone can identify these markings..." The phone rang inside the house, cutting him off. Eleanor went to answer it, returning moments later with a troubled expression. "It's Frank," she said. "Howard Bennett is missing." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool stone in his hand. "Since when?" "Since yesterday evening. His wife says he took his truck and headed out toward the desert. Said he had business to attend to." Eleanor's eyes met Mason's. "Frank thinks he might have gone to the ridge." The implication settled over them like a shadow. Howard had been vocal about his opposition to what he saw as superstition and blasphemy. If he'd gone to the ridge, to the circle... Mason pocketed the strange stone and turned to Noah. Does your mother know you're here?" The boy nodded. "She dropped me off on her way to an emergency call at the Peterson Ranch. Their prize bull got into something toxic." "Good. I need you to stay here with Eleanor. Keep documenting what we know about the stones, the circle, everything." Noah looked disappointed. "But I want to help. I can feel what Spirit feels. I might be able to—" "You are helping," Mason interrupted firmly. "Knowledge is our strongest defense right now. If Howard has done something to the circle, we'll need every scrap of information to make it right." Eleanor touched Mason's arm. "You're going up there." "I have to," he said grimly. "I'll call Will, have him meet me." He glanced at Spirit, who was already turning toward the driveway, as if anticipating their departure. "And it seems I'll have company." Within the hour, Mason and Will were in Will's truck, heading toward Hollow Ridge. Spirit followed, keeping pace effortlessly. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, but dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, unusual for this time of year. "Storm's coming," Will noted, eyeing the sky. "Bad one by the look of it." Mason nodded his thoughts on Howard Bennett and what the man might have done. If he's disturbed the circle. Will gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You really believe all this, don't you? The sleeping thing under the ridge, the guardian stones?" Mason gave his old friend a sidelong glance. "You were there, Will. You saw what we saw." "I saw something," Will admitted. "Just not sure what to make of it." He was silent for a moment. "But I trust you, Mace, and I trust that boy's connection to that horse, and if you say there's something that needs guarding against, well," he shrugged. "That's good enough for me." They reached the base of the ridge as the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the desert. The air felt charged, heavy with electricity, and something else, a tension that made the hairs on the back of Mason's neck stand up. "Howard's truck," Will pointed out, nodding toward a dusty blue pickup parked haphazardly at the trailhead. They parked beside it and began the ascent, Spirit leading the way. The horse moved with urgency, now picking the most direct path up the steep slope. Mason and Will struggled to keep pace, the rising wind and threatening storm adding to the difficulty. Halfway up, they found the first sign of Howard's passage, a memory stone dislodged from its place in the circle and discarded carelessly among the rocks. Mason retrieved it carefully, wrapping it in his bandana before tucking it into his pocket. "He's dismantling the circle," Mason said grimly. "Just like before." They found 2 more stones as they climbed, each displaced from its proper position. By the time they neared the summit, the storm was almost upon them. Lightning flashed across the darkened sky, followed almost immediately by deafening thunder. The wind whipped around them with unnatural force, as if trying to push them back down the ridge. "This ain't natural," Will shouted over the gale. "No storm comes on this fast." Mason knew he was right. This was no ordinary weather pattern. This was a response, a reaction to the breaking of the circle. The entity beneath the ridge was stirring. They reached the summit just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The scene that greeted them confirmed their worst fears. Howard Bennett stood within the ruined circle, the anchor stone clutched in his hands. Around him, the remaining memory stones had been kicked aside, their careful arrangement destroyed. Howard Mason called out, fighting against the wind. "What have you done?" Bennett turned his face a mask of righteous determination. "What needed doing?" he shouted back. "Ending this pagan nonsense once and for all." Spirit had stopped at the edge of the disturbed circle, pawing at the ground anxiously. Mason could sense the horse's distress, and something else. A growing awareness of movement beneath the very rock they stood upon. "You don't understand what you're doing." Mason tried again, inching closer. That circle was protection for all of us. Howard clutched the anchor stone tighter. "Protection from what?" "Your delusions." Your brother's ghost. This is blasphemy. Mason devil worship. It's older than any religion. Mason countered, taking another step forward. Older than the names we give to good and evil. Put the stone back, Howard, before it's too late. A crack of lightning split the sky directly overhead, striking the ground just beyond the circle's edge. The impact sent them all staggering, the boom of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very mountain beneath them. In the brilliant flash, Mason saw it just for an instant. A shadow rising from the ground where the anchor stone had been. Not smoke, not dust, but something darker. Something with purpose. Howard saw it too. The color drained from his face, his righteous anger replaced by primal fear. What? What is that? What you've awakened, Mason said, grimly extending his hand. Give me the stone, Howard. Now. For a moment it seemed Howard might comply. His hands trembled around the anchor stone, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Then his expression hardened again, the fear giving way to denial. No, it's a trick. Some kind of projection or hallucination. He backed away, the precious stone still clutched to his chest. I'm ending this. All of it. Before Mason could reach him, Howard turned and fled toward the far side of the summit where a steep path led down the opposite face of the ridge. Will started after him, but Mason caught his arm. The circle first, he shouted over the howling wind. We need to remake it as best we can, even without the anchor stone. They worked quickly, gathering the scattered memory stones and placing them in their approximate positions. Spirit helped nudging stones with his muzzle, indicating where each belonged. But without the anchor stone at the center, the circle remained incomplete, its power diminished. The shadow Mason had glimpsed was more visible now, a darkness seeping from the earth where the anchor stone had rested. It moved like liquid smoke, spreading outward in tendrils that seemed to test the boundaries of the broken circle. What now? Will asked, eyeing the shadow warily. Before Mason could answer, Spirit surged forward, entering the circle and positioning himself directly over the seeping darkness. The horse lowered his head muzzle, nearly touching the ground, and let out a sound unlike any Mason had heard before, part whinny, part human cry. For a heartbeat, the air around Spirit shimmered, and Mason saw, or thought he saw, Daniel standing there instead, hands pressed against an invisible barrier holding back the darkness. Dan, he whispered, taking an instinctive step forward. Will caught his shoulder. Look! He pointed toward the path Howard had taken. Through the curtain of rain, they could see Howard struggling back up toward the summit, his face a mask of terror. Behind him, the shadow had somehow flowed down the mountainside and was now pursuing him, moving faster than any natural phenomenon could. It wants the stone, Mason realized. The anchor stone is the key, the lock that keeps it contained. Howard reached the summit, gasping for breath, his earlier righteousness completely shattered. "Help me!" he cried, stumbling toward them. It's alive!" The shadow surged after him, no longer smoke-like, but more solid, forming shapes that hurt the eyes to look upon limbs that were too long angles that shouldn't exist. "The stone, Howard," Mason demanded. "Give it to me." Howard fumbled in his jacket, producing the anchor stone with shaking hands. He thrust it toward Mason, just as the shadow reached him, wrapping around his ankles like dark water. Mason grabbed the stone, its surface ice cold despite the heat that should have come from Howard's body. With no time to think, he sprinted to the center of the broken circle where Spirit still stood guard. "Move!" he commanded the horse. Spirit stepped aside, and Mason placed the anchor stone back in its depression at the center of the circle. The moment it touched the earth, a pulse of energy shot through the ground, knocking Mason off his feet. The scattered memory stones glowed briefly, then dimmed. The circle was incomplete, the pattern disrupted. It wasn't enough. Howard's scream cut through the storm's fury. The shadow had enveloped him to the waist, now pulling him inexorably toward the edge of the summit. Will rushed to help, grabbing Howard's outstretched hands, but the shadow's pull was too strong. "Mason!" Will shouted desperately. "It's taking him!" Mason looked from his friend to the broken circle decision tearing at him. The circle needed to be completed, but Howard's life hung in the balance. It was Spirit who moved first. The horse galloped to where Will struggled to hold on to Howard, positioning himself beside them. With a movement that spoke of intelligence beyond any animal, Spirit lowered his head beneath Howard, providing a platform against which the man could brace himself. "Pull him up," Mason shouted, turning his attention back to the circle. The small warning stone Noah had found burned in his pocket. Mason pulled it out, its cool surface now warm against his palm. The symbols etched into it glowed with an inner light, and suddenly Mason understood. This wasn't just a warning, it was a key. A backup. He placed it in the center of the circle alongside the anchor stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the smaller stone melted its substance, flowing into and around the anchor stone, reinforcing it. The copper veins in both stones pulsed once, twice, then flared with brilliant light. A shockwave emanated from the center, racing around the circle. Each memory stone it touched flared to life, regardless of its current position. The pattern reasserted itself, not physically, but energetically, a ghost of the original circle, but with growing substance. The shadow attacking Howard recoiled as if struck. Will and Spirit seized the opportunity, pulling the terrified man fully back onto solid ground. Howard collapsed, shaking uncontrollably but alive. At the circle's center, the anchor stone now glowed steadily, the copper vein pulsing like a heartbeat. The darkness that had seeped from the earth was receding, drawn back toward the center, pulled by the stone's power. "It's working," Mason breathed, hardly daring to hope. But the entity wasn't surrendering easily. The shadow contracted, then expanded explosively, sending tendrils in all directions. One lashed out at Mason, wrapping around his wrist with burning cold. Another struck Will across the chest, knocking him backward. A third circled Spirit's legs, trying to topple the powerful horse. Pain shot up Mason's arm where the shadow touched him, not just physical pain, but something deeper, as if the entity was reaching into his very essence. Images flashed through his mind. Daniel alone in the dark, eternally vigilant. The hunger growing beneath the ridge, the land withering, dying, consumed. Through the haze of pain and visions, Mason saw Spirit rearing up, fighting against the shadow's hold. The horse's eyes blazed with that copper light, Daniel's light, and in that moment, Mason understood what needed to be done. "The Guardians," he gasped through gritted teeth. "We have to become the Guardians. Willingly." Will, recovering from the shadow's blow, staggered to Mason's side. "What do you mean?" "Daniel made a choice," Mason explained, fighting through the pain. "A sacrifice. We have to do the same. Commit ourselves to the circle, to protecting it." He looked toward Howard, who was watching them with wide, terrified eyes. "All of us." Understanding dawned on Will's weathered face. He nodded once, then extended his hand toward the anchor stone. "I choose to stand guard," he said firmly. Mason joined his hand to Will's. "I choose to remember to preserve the knowledge." They both looked to Howard, who shrank back. I can't." "You broke it," Mason said bluntly. "You have a responsibility." Spirit approached Howard, lowering his great head until they were eye to eye. Something passed between them, a communication without words, and Howard's terror slowly gave way to resignation, then resolve. He crawled forward, placing his trembling hand atop the others on the anchor stone. "I choose to believe," he said hoarsely, "to stop denying what I know to be true." The moment his hand joined theirs, the anchor stone pulsed more strongly. The copper vein expanded, sending threads of light along the ground, reconnecting the scattered memory stones in their proper pattern. The circle reformed not physically, but spiritually, a bond of energy and commitment. Spirit reared up once more, then brought his hooves down directly on the anchor stone. Instead of shattering it, the impact sent a column of copper light shooting upward into the storm clouds. Lightning answered, striking the exact same spot connecting earth and sky in a circuit of power. The shadow entity shrieked a sound that existed not in air, but in the minds of all who heard it. It withdrew from Mason, from Will, from Spirit, pulling back toward the anchor stone. As it touched the stone, the darkness seemed to fold in on itself, compressing, condensing, until it was drawn completely into the stone's depths. The copper vein within the anchor stone darkened momentarily, as if absorbing the shadow, then resumed its steady heartbeat-like pulse. The storm above them began to dissipate with unnatural speed. The wind died down, the rain ceased, and rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. Within minutes, the sky was clearing, as if the tempest had never been. Mason, Will, and Howard slowly withdrew their hands from the anchor stone, each feeling subtly changed by the experience. A bond had formed between them, reluctant in Howard's case, but undeniable nonetheless. They had committed themselves to the circle, to the guardianship, and something in them had shifted to accommodate this new responsibility. Spirit approached Mason, nuzzling his shoulder gently. In the horse's eyes, Mason saw approval, gratitude, and something else. A flicker of Daniel more present than before, as if the remaking of the circle had strengthened his connection to this world. "What now?" Will asked, looking around at the memory stones, some still out of place, despite their energetic reconnection. "We rebuild properly," Mason said. "Set each stone in its physical place. Document everything. Make sure this knowledge isn't lost again." Howard remained silent, his earlier zealotry completely shattered. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I thought I was fighting against superstition, but—" He gestured helplessly at the anchor stone, still glowing faintly in the afternoon sun. "There are older truths than the ones we are taught in church," Mason said, not unkindly. "Deeper responsibilities." They spent the next hour carefully repositioning each memory stone according to Spirit's guidance. The horse indicated the proper placement with uncanny precision, sometimes scraping the ground with his hoof, other times simply standing and waiting until a stone was correctly placed. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The circle was complete once more, but changed. The anchor stone's copper vein pulsed more prominently than before, and faint lines of energy visibly connected it to each memory stone in the circle. "It's stronger now," Will observed. "More aware." Mason nodded. "Our commitment made it so. We're bound to it now, and it to us." They began the descent back to the trucks, each lost in thought. Howard maintained a respectful distance, his worldview clearly shattered and reforming. Spirit moved ahead of them, occasionally stopping to look back, as if making sure they were following. Halfway down, Mason paused, a realization striking him. "Noah," he said suddenly. "The boy's connection to Spirit, to Daniel, he's meant to be part of this too. He found the warning stone, brought it to us when we needed it most." Will considered this. "The next generation of guardians," he suggested. "Makes sense. Knowledge has to be passed on." Even Howard nodded in agreement, his earlier antagonism towards the Parker boy apparently forgotten in the face of what they'd experienced. When they reached the base of the ridge, they found Noah waiting beside Eleanor's truck, his young face alight with expectation. "I knew you'd need me," he said as they approached. "Spirit told me. Not in words, but—" He tapped his chest. "In here." Mason wasn't even surprised anymore. "How did you get here? Did your mother bring you?" Noah shook his head. "I borrowed her truck." Seeing Mason's raised eyebrow, he quickly added, "I have my learner's permit." And it was important. Really important. It was, Mason agreed, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. You're part of this now. The circle needs 4 guardians north, southeast, west. The 4 directions, 4 elements. Noah nodded eagerly. I've been reading about it. In Daniel's journals. He wrote that the original guardians were 4 tribal elders before the settlers came. His expression grew serious. I want to learn everything. To be ready. Mason glanced at Spirit, who stood nearby watching them with those knowing eyes. I think you already are. They returned to Thornfield Ranch as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor was waiting on the porch, relief washing over her face as she saw them all return safely. Mason embraced her, feeling the tension drain from her body. It's done, he murmured into her hair. The circle is remade stronger than before. She drew back to study his face, and Howard Mason glanced to where Howard Bennett sat in Will's truck, staring out at nothing, his reality still realigning itself. Changed, he said simply, as we all are. That night they gathered around the kitchen table. Mason, Eleanor, Will, Noah, and to everyone's surprise, Howard. The Guardian's record lay open before them, Daniel's journals, now supplemented with their own observations, Noah's detailed drawings of each memory stone, and Mason's account of what had transpired on the ridge. We need to establish a routine, Mason said, taking charge naturally. Regular checks of the circle, monitoring for any signs of disturbance, training for what to do if something goes wrong again. I can handle the documentation, Noah offered eagerly, cataloging everything, creating a proper reference system. Will nodded approvingly. I'll take care of the physical maintenance, making sure the path stays clear, keeping an eye out for trespassers or natural disruptions. Howard spoke up hesitantly. I know people in town. I can help manage perceptions, keep curiosity at bay. He met Mason's eyes, sincere despite his discomfort. It's the least I can do. Mason acknowledged this with a nod. Howard's influence in the community could indeed be valuable, redirected toward protection rather than opposition. Eleanor, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke. And what about Daniel, about Spirit? They all looked toward the window, where Spirit could be seen in the paddock, his coat silvered by moonlight. The horse stood motionless, head raised like a sentinel on duty. Daniel chose his role 32 years ago, Mason said softly. He became the primary guardian, the direct link between our world and whatever that thing is beneath the ridge. Spirit is his connection to us, his way of continuing to protect what he loves. Noah, with the innocent wisdom of youth, added, He's not gone, Mrs. Thornfield. He's just serving in a different way. Eleanor smiled through gathering tears. I know, dear. I think I've always known somehow. As they continued planning their shared guardianship, Mason felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. For decades, he'd carried the weight of his brother's disappearance, like an open wound. Now that wound was healing not through closure or forgetting, but through understanding and purpose. Daniel hadn't been taken from them. He had chosen a path of service and protection, and now through Spirit he had called them to join him in that sacred trust. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself at Thornfield Ranch. Noah came daily after school, dividing his time between working with Spirit and meticulously documenting every aspect of the guardianship in the ever-expanding record. Will made regular trips to the ridge, checking the circle, maintaining the path. Howard, true to his word, became a buffer between the ranch and the curious townsfolk, his newfound respect for the old ways gradually influencing others. Eleanor's garden flourished beyond all expectation, producing herbs and vegetables in abundance. She began sharing the bounty with neighbors, then with the community center, her generosity creating goodwill that further insulated them from unwanted attention. Mason himself felt younger, more vital than he had in years. The purpose that had come with guardianship seemed to energize him, giving him a second wind in his later years. He spent hours with Spirit, their silent communion deepening with each passing day. Sometimes in the quiet of dawn or dusk, he would catch glimpses of Daniel in the horse's eyes, not ghostly or supernatural, but present in a way that defied simple explanation. One evening, as summer gave way to fall, Mason stood at the paddock fence, watching Spirit graze peacefully in the golden light. Eleanor joined him, slipping her arm through his. "Do you remember what Elijah said?" she asked softly, "about sacrifices not always requiring death." Mason nodded his eyes, never leaving Spirit. "Some require eternal vigilance instead." "I've been thinking about that," she continued, "about Daniel's choice, and now ours. It's not just about keeping something contained, is it? It's about balance, remembering our place in the greater whole." Mason considered this. "The land remembers those who serve it," he quoted. "I think that's what Elijah meant. When we commit to protecting something beyond ourselves, it changes us, connects us." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "All those years we thought he was gone. But he was just serving in a different way, wasn't he?" "He still is," Mason said softly. As if in confirmation, Spirit raised his head, looking directly at them. The setting sun caught his eyes, illuminating the copper flecks within. For just a moment, Mason could have sworn he saw Daniel smile in those eyes, not sad or trapped, but peaceful, purposeful. The horse turned away, resuming his grazing with the easy contentment of one who knows exactly where he belongs and what he's meant to do. Mason squeezed Eleanor's hand, feeling the same certainty settle in his own heart. The circle was complete, the guardianship established, the memory preserved. And somewhere between this world and whatever lay beyond, Daniel Thornfield continued his watch, not lost, but transformed, not gone, but serving still, through the bond of blood and memory, through the vessel of Spirit, and through the commitment of those who chose to remember and protect the legacy would endure. For as long as the circle remained, as long as the guardians stood watch, the land would remember. And so would they.